Joseph Banks' Plant Collectors, a tale of curiosity and adventure. When the Endeavour slipped quietly out of Plymouth Harbour in August 1768, bound for the farthest seas, few aboard could have guessed that their voyage would forever change the course of science, trade, and the very landscape of the British Empire. At the heart of this grand enterprise was a young, ambitious botanist, Joseph Banks, just 25, tall, energetic, with a restless curiosity burning in his veins. Banks had persuaded the Royal Society to allow him, at his own expense, to join Captain James Cook's expedition to observe the transit of Venus in Tahiti. But for Banks, astronomy was only part of the lure. He had his eye on something richer, the untapped treasure of plants, seeds, and natural wonders hidden in the unexplored corners of the Pacific. The dream of a green empire. Europe in the 18th century was gripped by botanical fever. Gardens were not merely ornaments of leisure. They were laboratories of empire. Exotic plants could feed armies, sweeten tea, or turn fortunes. Nutmeg, cloves, breadfruit, these were more than curiosities. They were weapons of economic power. Banks saw the Endeavour voyage as his chance to weave the natural riches of distant lands into the tapestry of Britain's expanding empire. He brought with him a team: the brilliant Swedish naturalist Daniel Solander, a student of Carl Linnaeus, the gifted but ill-fated artist Sidney Parkinson, who would sketch hundreds of specimens with meticulous care, and several gardeners, collectors, and servants. Together, they formed a miniature academy of natural science aboard the Endeavour. Tahiti, the island of paradise. When the Endeavour dropped anchor in Tahiti in 1769, Banks was overwhelmed by the island's abundance. The lush valleys spilled with breadfruit trees, bananas, coconuts, and fragrant flowers unknown to Europe. With Solander at his side and Parkinson sketching furiously, Banks roamed the forests, recording every detail. He marveled at the breadfruit, a starchy fruit cooked by the Tahitians as a staple food. Here, Banks glimpsed a vision. What if breadfruit could be carried across oceans to feed enslaved laborers in the Caribbean? A simple tree might reduce hunger, stabilize colonies, and enrich Britain's plantations. The thought lodged in his mind like a seed that would not let go. The Tahitians, generous and curious, guided the botanists into their gardens and groves. Banks, for all his youthful arrogance, treated them with unusual respect. He collected not only plants but stories, customs, and words, his notebooks blending science with anthropology. To him, each specimen was not just a leaf or flower, but a key to understanding a whole world. The Great Barrier Reef. The Endeavour sailed westward into seas no European ship had dared. It was in 1770, off the coast of Australia, that Banks' destiny collided with one of the richest treasure troves of nature ever encountered. Australia, then called New Holland, was a land of strangeness. Kangaroos bounded across the plains. Eucalyptus trees exhaled a sharp fragrance, and brilliant parrots filled the skies. Banks and Solander collected feverishly, sometimes gathering over 100 new species in a single day. Parkinson's sketches glowed with color, capturing for Europe its first visions of the continent's flora and fauna. At Botany Bay, Banks was ecstatic. The shoreline teemed with unfamiliar life: bottle-brush trees, wattles, banksias, later named after him. He wrote of the place with such enthusiasm that it would later influence Britain's decision to establish a colony there. But danger shadowed discovery when the Endeavour struck a reef in Queensland, tearing its hull on the coral. The voyage teetered on disaster. While sailors frantically pumped water, Banks watched helplessly as trunks of specimens, months of work, were thrown overboard to lighten the ship. Still, enough survived to make history. Loss and triumph. Not all of Banks' companions would live to see England again. Sidney Parkinson, the tireless artist, died of dysentery on the return voyage. His final sketches, delicate outlines unfinished by color, seemed to echo his own fading life. Others too succumbed to fever and hardship. The voyage was a crucible, but its harvest of knowledge was unparalleled. Over 1,300 new plant species, hundreds of animals, and vast ethnographic notes. When the Endeavour limped back to England in 1771, Joseph Banks returned not just as a botanist, but as a visionary. His collections filled the halls of the British Museum. His drawings astonished scientists, and his reputation soared. He was soon appointed to the Royal Society and, eventually, became its president for over 40 years. The web of collectors. But Banks' story did not end with the Endeavour. Instead, it expanded outward like the roots of a mighty tree. From his base at Kew Gardens, he orchestrated a global network of plant collectors, gardeners, and explorers. Ships carried his orders across oceans. Collect, preserve, send back seeds, roots, bulbs, and notes. He dispatched men to Africa for coffee, to India for spices, to the South Pacific for breadfruit. He encouraged William Bligh, later infamous for the mutiny on the Bounty, to carry breadfruit from Tahiti to the Caribbean. Though Bligh's first voyage ended in mutiny, his second succeeded, and soon breadfruit was planted in Jamaica, fulfilling Banks' dream. Collectors often lived perilous lives. They hacked through jungles, braved fevers, shipwrecks, and hostility, all for fragile specimens that might or might not survive the journey home. Many died unknown, their sacrifices buried with them. But their seeds blossomed in Britain's greenhouses. The legacy of empire. Banks' vision was not merely scientific curiosity, it was imperial strategy. He understood that whoever controlled plants controlled power. By moving crops across continents, he reshaped economies and landscapes. Tea from China found new soil in India. Rubber trees from Brazil would one day transform Malaya. Sugar, cotton, and breadfruit became staples of colonial exploitation. In Banks' era, this seemed triumph. To modernize, it is a more complex legacy. Science intertwined with empire, knowledge with domination. Yet, without Banks' collectors, the very face of our gardens, kitchens, and farms would be utterly different. The man behind the collections. In London, Banks became both gatekeeper and patron. Scientists, explorers, even kings sought his counsel. He advised King George III, championed voyages of exploration, and transformed Kew Gardens into the greatest botanical center in the world. Yet he was no mere administrator. Even in his later years, crippled by gout, he longed for the thrill of discovery. His letters to collectors were full of practical advice, encouragement, and sometimes stern reminders of duty. He understood the hardships they faced, for he too had felt fever in his veins, seen storms batter ships, and buried companions at sea. A world changed. By the time Joseph Banks died in 1820, the world was greener and more connected because of him and his collectors. Plants that once grew in secret valleys of Tahiti or on lonely Australian hillsides now bloomed in English gardens. Food and medicine, color and fragrance, industry and empire, all bore the fingerprints of Banks' vision. But his legacy is double-edged. The same plants that enriched Europe were often taken without consent. Their movement tied to slavery, colonization, and exploitation. The breadfruit that fed Caribbean plantations also fed a system of human bondage. The gardens that dazzled Europe were watered by sweat and suffering abroad. Epilogue. The collectors' quiet voices. Today, as we walk through the glass houses at Kew or read Banks' journals, it is easy to see only the triumph of science. Yet behind every pressed specimen lies a story of a Tahitian guide showing a tree, of Parkinson sketching with trembling hands, of nameless sailors carrying boxes of earth, of collectors who perished in jungles for a flower no one had seen before. Joseph Banks may have been the conductor, but the music was made by countless hands, plant collectors whose voices are faint, yet whose work still breathes in every garden, every orchard, every steaming cup of tea.